Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas. In our brand new study in Christian apologetics, we're looking at Cold Case Christianity by J. Warner Wallace. And we're going to look at chapters 5 through 7. We'll look at pages 89 to 119, and we'll look at evidence and theory. It'll be our third lesson, but we're going to pick up 3 chapters this time. So let's begin in block 1. Let's take a look at the importance of word studies, which I can tell you right now I thoroughly agree with the importance of word studies. And Wallace begins with the Gospel of Mark as an example. And he said that in his secular field, word studies are called forensic statement analysis. Forensic statement analysis. And these studies reveal to us that the Gospel of Mark was actually the Gospel account of Simon Peter, but penned by Mark. It represents Simon Peter's eyewitness observations. And I've known that for years, and so I agree with him completely. That's pretty much agreed on by scholars that the Gospel of Mark is really the Gospel of Simon Peter. And Peter is referred to more than any other disciple in the Gospel. He's referred to 26 times. Mark uses the most concise, most familiar version of Peter's name. And Simon Peter appears in 1:15 and in 16:7. Therefore, he forms a bookend to the entire Gospel as well. Peter is always referred to in the kindest, most forgiving way in Mark. And Mark is the one that mentions Capernaum as Peter's hometown because his mother lived there. So that familiar side of his personal existence is mentioned in the Gospel of Mark. Mark omits Jesus' personal life, just like Peter did in his preaching in the book of Acts. Therefore, Mark is the eyewitness account of Simon Peter, arrived at through critical examination of Scripture, what Wallace called in his business forensic statement analysis. His call-out bag tip is always pay attention to word usage, examine the language of Scripture, and examine the language of Scripture as an interested reader. In this way, we underscore the Gospels as eyewitness testimony by giving it that intense of an interested look. Break down the language, look at the language, look at word usage, which Greek words are being employed. Through that analysis, you can many times identify who really is speaking. And in the Gospel of Mark, it's Simon Peter. And John Mark was a very good friend of Simon Peter. Simon Peter is the one who ordained Mark as a bishop later. And so that gives us our first important aspect of Christian apologetics, that Christian apologetics includes very serious word studies, very serious investigation into the original language, into the word studies and word usage of the original language. Now this next block, block 2, I really like the fact that he included this because non-Christians might call this a weakness, the fact that there are artifacts present in the Scriptures. And Wallace admits that before he became a Christian, he viewed artifacts as weaknesses to the gospel, but he said now he doesn't, especially after years of being a detective, now he realizes that artifacts simply need to be identified and separated out. So let's go to block 2 and take a look at that part of his apologetic, separating artifacts from evidence. Textual artifacts in the scriptures, we must distinguish between evidence and artifacts. Anything added to the eyewitness testimony after the fact is an artifact. Scribes sometimes added artifacts during their copying because that's how you made copies. Copies were made by hand by scribes. Now he actually does list artifacts in Scripture. John 8, 1 through 11, the woman accused of adultery is not in the earliest accounts we have of John's Gospel. Luke 22, 43 and 44, the angel appears in the Garden of Gethsemane during Christ's agony. This passage is excluded in early manuscripts of Luke. I always wondered about that one. And that is an artifact that was added later by a scribe, evidently. John 5:4, an angel descends to stir the pool of water for healing purposes at the pool of Bethesda. That is not present in our best early manuscripts, added later by a scribe. 1 John 5:7, there's an expression for the doctrine of the Trinity that is given, but it is in none of the early manuscripts. It only shows up very, very late in the 16th century. So that's someone trying to insert a doctrine or to reinforce a doctrine, not in the early manuscripts. Now in Acts 15, we have it pleased Silas to abide there still was inserted in the manuscript, and that is not in any early manuscripts of the book of Acts. So, note 2, separating artifacts from evidence. Unrelated artifacts do not disqualify the overall reliability of an eyewitness account. We simply need to separate them from the evidence. And there are principles to do this. Recognize late additions to the text. Recognize differences in character, differences in word usage. Recognize explanations for the presence of an artifact. Recognize the impact the artifact will have or will not have. Recognize insignificance when it is apparent and qualifies nothing of the truth. And so, note 3, Wallace recommends the practice of textual criticism when doing study of Scripture. Early manuscripts provide our early snapshot of the scene. Textual criticism recognizes differences in word usage. Scribal clarifications can be recognized and separated out. In spite of artifacts, the testimony should give us a coherent picture of Christ that we recognize as reliable. Textual artifacts are not an insurmountable obstacle. Not an insurmountable obstacle. Adopt a reasonable approach to artifacts when studying Scripture. Take up the practice of textual criticism. And all scholars today agree with this, that any study of Scripture must include textual criticism, where we do evaluate the actual text and we look for artifacts in order to identify them and separate them out so we get at the best rendition of a passage of Scripture. So block 1 could be called textual criticism word studies, and then we get textual criticism separation of artifacts in block 2. And that leads to a very strong conviction type statement in block 3, where Wallace is going to tell us that he believes The resurrection is true eyewitness testimony. But he says that there are opponents of Christianity who say that it could be a Christian conspiracy. So he wants to address that, but he does believe through textual criticism that the resurrection is true eyewitness testimony. The resurrection is true eyewitness testimony, and it is further verified through textual criticism. Let's take a look at block 3. He says, resist conspiracy theories. The resurrection was not a Christian conspiracy for several reasons. The book of Acts tells us that as many as 120 eyewitnesses were in the upper room following Jesus' ascension. The apostles had no effective way of communicating with each other quickly after their dispersion. Their testimony was maintained for approximately 60 years, with John being the last to die. The apostles had diverse backgrounds, diverse families and communities. They were apart from each other for decades. And therefore, this supports the fact that this was not a conspiracy that was held. Now, persecution and martyrdom has to be looked at. Each of the apostles suffered physical persecution and eventually martyrdom. If we look at martyrdom, Peter was crucified upside down. James was killed by sword in Jerusalem. Thomas was murdered by a mob in Milapore. James the Just was cast off the temple roof and then bludgeoned to death. Paul was beheaded in Rome at the order of Nero, the emperor at the time. Additional comments in conclusion. There were 500 eyewitnesses to the resurrection described by Paul in 1 Corinthians 15:6. We must conclude from all things considered from above that there was no conspiracy and that all witnesses were telling the truth. It is unreasonable to believe that the apostles died for something they knew to be untrue. His call-out bag tip, a healthy, underline healthy and rational skepticism toward conspiracy theories is important for further verification of the apostles' witness and testimony. The resurrection is true apostolic witness. The resurrection is true apostolic witness, period. That's the conclusion, and I agree with that entirely. And we get tremendous additional content here for our apologetics. Remember, the first half of the book is, first part of the book, he divides it into 2 parts. First part is methodology. Now we've gone through the fact that, number 1, identify presuppositions and bracket them. Take up the practice of inference for methodology. Think circumstantially. The cumulative circumstantial evidence is strong verification. Test your witnesses. Have high expectations from testimony and its reliability. And then now, take up textual criticism and word study and separate out artifacts. All of this leads to the definite conclusion that the apostolic testimony in the Gospels is true, and for Wallace, true beyond doubt. So that's going to wrap up a very powerful third lesson that gives us really a great deal of substantial content on textual criticism. And I really like the fact that he actually did give us instances of artifacts in Block 2. Some I knew about. I knew about most of them, but I'm glad that he listed them. And really, he just says we need to identify them and separate them out. In most new Bibles, artifacts have brackets around them and a note at the bottom of the page saying this is possibly a scribal insertion. But that'll wrap up chapters 5 through 7, pages 89 to 119. We will pick up in chapter 8 in our next lesson. And it's going to be a 3-chapter lesson also. It'll be 8, 9, and 10.